We are in a global drumbeat right at the moment talking about climate change and global warming. One of the things that is affected by climate change is agriculture. But some of what we are seeing is man-made, but man-made in a different way than you may guess. Weather modification programs, experimental ones done by private companies, done by the United States government, done by states across the United States, are underway. There's more than 50 of them in operation across the United States. All of these impact agriculture because they change the microclimates needed for agriculture to survive. None of these programs that I know of today, and this is all public record, are available at any time with oversight, agricultural oversight or public oversight. These programs impact agriculture, and there are programs around the world. International corporations are modifying our weather all the time, and they're modifying it in ways that cover thousands and thousands of square miles. Most of it is chemically altered, so that what happens is that we are putting chemicals, ground-based chemicals that are shot into the air, or chemicals coming from airplanes that change and modify our weather.
We find that the climate system is relatively insensitive, consistent with the big graphic that was shown earlier, where it showed that we're not warming nearly as fast as the IPCC climate models suggest we should have been warming. So the point is, a lot of evidence now is being amassed which suggests that the climate system is simply not as sensitive to our addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as most scientists think it is. I also want to say, since we're talking about most scientists, I've heard 97%, 98%. There's a recent paper by John Cook and co-authors who looked at thousands of research papers which have been published in the scientific literature to see what fraction, support the scientific consensus on global warming. Well, it turns out that the 97% consensus that they found, I am indeed part of, and Senator Sessions mentioned he would agree with it too. And my associate, John Christie, he agrees with it. In fact, all skeptics that I know of that work in this business, all are part of that 97%, because the 97% includes people who think humans have some influence on climate. Well, that's a fairly innocuous statement. And that's something that continually annoys me, is those of us that are called deniers. It's never actually, I think the D word was actually used by the chairman today. It's never actually been pointed out. What is it that we deny? Also, this 97%. Well, what does the 97% consensus mean? What do all of those people agree to? Well, they agree to something fairly innocuous, and it's something that most of us agree to, that humans must have some influence on climate. The question is how much, and how much influence makes all the difference in the world if you're going to be basing policy decisions, carbon taxes, regulations, legislation, whatever, on them. It makes all the difference in the world exactly how much warming we can expect due to human activities.
Welcome to Natural News. Today we're talking about climate change. A new article in the UK Daily Mail says that scientists from Harvard are going to release aerosols into the atmosphere to block out the sun and prevent global warming. Thank you for joining me. This is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger, editor of naturalnews.com. I'm also a critic of the climate change hoax because we know the NOAA faked a lot of the data. We also know that CO2 is loved by plants, and if we have more CO2 in the atmosphere, more plants will grow, food will grow more easily, and reforestation will happen more rapidly. And finally, we know that CO2 is at one of its lowest levels now in the history of the Earth. It was more than 10 times higher in the past. So when they tell you that it's a red alert that CO2 is over 400 parts per million, don't sweat it. That's actually the lowest that it's been, or nearly the lowest that it's been in the history of the planet. Just a very slight uptick now recently in the last few decades. And by the way, scientists are also now telling you that Mayan civilization 1,500 years ago was wiped out by global warming, and that is, of course, a long time before the invention of the combustion engine or the use of fossil fuels as a primary energy source for civilization. So now these scientists at Harvard are saying they're going to launch aerosols into the atmosphere and try to block the sun to stop global warming. This is the latest insanity from these global warming scientists, these climate change lunatics, who are going to screw up the entire planet for everyone. What if they get this wrong? What if their little pilot project is a, quote, success, and the federal government gives them, I don't know, $100 billion to do this on a massive planetary scale? What if they get it wrong? And the sun is blocked a little too much? Or what if there's a volcanic eruption that ejects all kinds of material into the atmosphere and blocks out the sun on top of the Harvard researcher sun blocking experiment, and we get too much blockage of the sun? And what happens then? Well, it's called global famine, massive collapse of human civilization, worldwide starvation, collapse in the food supply, and so on. It's happened before. In fact, it's documented in human history. Large volcanic eruptions have been followed by dimming of the sun, the reduction of solar energy that reaches the Earth's surface, in other words, and has resulted in a collapse of food production for a year or 2 years. It's happened before. Just look at the history of our recent civilization. Even in the 1800s that happened, and the 1700s that happened, and the 1600s that happened. It's going to happen again. So if you let these crazy scientists play God with the atmosphere and block out the atmosphere, block out the sunlight, you're asking for destruction. I mean, the law of unintended consequences says that when scientists play God with the planet or with the seed supply or with chemicals or what have you, things often go bad. And this is the problem with these people who believe the climate change hoax. You know, I'm a scientist, but I'm not funded by the government. I run a private laboratory called CWC Labs. And I've authored a book, a #1 best-selling science book. I've authored science papers. One will be published soon in a science journal, by the way. And I can tell you that most of the scientists out there get their funding from government or universities, which is also government indirectly. As a result, they produce the science that the government wants them to produce. Most scientists are entirely dependent on government funding, so they just play along with the narrative of the EPA, for example, or the narrative of the university, for example. Most of this climate change science that's being produced out there is bogus science. It's not even legitimate. They're making things up, they're altering data, they are deciding what outcome they want before they do the experiment, and now they're blaming climate change on everything. They say climate change causes diabetes, climate change causes obesity, they say. They say climate change causes you to be angry and violent. They say climate change causes mental disorders now. This is a recent science paper that actually claims that. It's all ridiculous. You know, climate change has been going on since the beginning of the planet. It's going to keep going on long after humanity destroys itself because it's basically a suicide cult at this point. So launching these aerosols into the atmosphere to try to block out the sun sounds like an idiotic idea. It sounds like complete scientific suicide. Sounds like something that happened in The Matrix. Remember where they said first they darkened the sky, and then they imprisoned all of humanity in the little pods and created an artificial reality for you to live in. Gosh, sounds like Harvard scientists and Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg had a baby and created a dystopian society of human slavery via climate change false narratives and electronic augmented reality fantasies. I mean, that's what it's coming to. These people are totally insane, and they're going to destroy everything if we let them continue to trick us into believing their lunatic science. Look, we got to get back to basics. Stop messing with the atmosphere. The sun is fine. We don't need to block it out. Most people lack sunlight. They lack vitamin D. That's why cancer rates are so high all across the first world nations. We're not getting enough sunlight. And enough with the CO2 slandering too. We need more CO2 so that plants will grow more quickly. I mean, greenhouse operations actually have CO2 generators in the greenhouse so they can grow plants more efficiently. We need some CO2. We only have 400 parts per million. Wouldn't hurt to be at 450, by the way. We could grow food a lot more quickly. We could reforest desert areas all across the planet. We could actually grow more green. You know, CO2 is the greening molecule of life for our planet. Without it, we would all be dead. So stop trying to blot out the sun and stop trying to destroy CO2. You scientists are insane. You're lunatics, all right? Stop playing God with our planet and just let us get back to the things that actually support life and support ecosystems, such as CO2 and sunlight and clean water and, you know, normal genetics without your GMO genetic pollution that's also threatening the entire food supply. It's very simple. Stop playing God with the planet and it will be just fine.
Late in the 10th century, the Vikings settled in Greenland. They found fertile fields and navigable waters teeming with codfish and seals. Generations had come to call this land their home.
So at the first they were farmers and settled on the large land, and they must have been very thrilled with the land they found.
Back then it was warmer, there was more trees. It was a very good farming land, very fertile, very green.
Rumors of this wonderful land must have spread, so you had more inhabitants. We think of this as a rough life, but they have had fashionable clothing and they have had time to play. It's been tough, but they have had good times as well.
The Viking communities in Greenland were vibrant and thriving by the year 1100. Within a few hundred years, they were all wiped out. The reason? Climate change.
The climate changed. That's a fact. Everybody knows that. So it was getting very hard to be a farmer. And, well, they didn't get enough hay for the animals. And the animals were freezing and starving, so the animals died. And when the animals die, the people die.
Around the year 1350, representative of the Bishop Regada visited Western settlement, and he wrote home and told that there's no one here.
By the end of the 15th century, Greenland had grown so cold that all of the Viking people who had lived there for generations were completely gone.
They must have wondered, what happened to our climate system? I mean, did we do something to cause this? That would be really, really useful to learn from the Vikings' example. How do we go about coping with big natural changes in the sun and the earth climate system?
How do humans cope with natural changes in the climate system? As scientists study the past, they're applying this knowledge to the changes experienced in the Earth's climate today. They are finding a natural cycle that modulates between cold periods and warm periods.
Climate is not a constant. We go through periods where it's much warmer, where it's much colder. We go through periods where it's wetter and drier. So the one thing we can say about climate in the future is that it will change.
As Greenland became cooler, other parts of the world were experiencing this cool down as well. In England, the Thames River began to freeze over during harsh winters. So did canals and waterways in the Netherlands. The Earth's climate was entering what scientists now call the Little Ice Age.
The condition is quite severe. In Western Europe, you can see people were actually praying in a church while the glacier is advancing. Essentially are praying that, please, God, don't let this ice coming and then ruin our village.
The Little Ice Age is part of a series of climate change eras that have been scientifically identified. In Europe, there was a warming period at the height of the Roman Empire, followed by cooling during the Dark Ages. The climate again warmed during the medieval period, followed by the Little Ice Age during the Renaissance.
The Little Ice Age ended at about 1850. So over the past 150 or so years, we've been in a cycle where the Earth has generally been warming.
This current climate cycle is what most people call global warming. Scientists have identified the recurring patterns of cooling and heating in the Earth's climate. But what causes this cycle?
The sun is the key ingredient to climate. I mean, 99.9% of the energy on the Earth that goes into the climate system comes from the sun.
The sun, of course, in terms of its light energy output, is probably the only true external driver of the Earth climate system, because there is no other forces on Earth that would supply that amount of energy for the air to move around, the ocean current to move around, or trees to grow. So there is no doubt that the sun is the main driver and supplier of energy to the Earth weather and climate system.
The sun's magnetism has a profound effect on the Earth. The sun's magnetic fields experience regular natural cycles. Sound familiar? When sunspot activity is compared to temperature changes over the same period, a remarkable correlation appears. Radiation from the sun seems to contribute to variations in temperature and climate on Earth. This is important when trying to understand climate patterns. The sun's natural cycles are a primary driver of our climate's natural cycles.
You have such a strong indication that there is this close relationship between how much the energy output from the sun changes and then how much the temperature changes.
What about the role that carbon dioxide, or CO2, plays in the Earth's climate? Is the warming being caused by human-generated carbon dioxide? Is it the sun? Or is it a combination of factors?
Humans do affect our environment, and one of the ways they do that is change the constituents in the atmosphere. I think the biggest driver is going to be other natural fluctuations, and carbon dioxide plays a small role in that.
The modern warming of Greenland has been going on since 1850, long before human-generated CO2 was entering the atmosphere. Looking at modern warming in general, a consistent pattern can be seen. With the best available records of temperature and atmospheric CO2 of the past 650,000 years, one finds that the Earth's temperature always rises first, followed by a rise in carbon dioxide.
A warmer Earth gives birth to more vegetation, which in turn has a more active carbon cycle. And so as a result, carbon dioxide may in fact follow the temperature change as opposed to being a leading indicator.
Published papers clearly shows that it is always the temperature rises first by at least several hundred years to a few thousand years. And then the carbon dioxide curve responds and it follows. So it is a very clear scientific consensus on this issue.
In other words, a warmer Earth leads to increased CO2 levels, not the other way around. That's an important realization, given the increased focus on human-generated CO2.
Most of us still have that nagging question in us, Yes, we have emitted all this carbon dioxide. Are we really melting all the ice cap? Or is it something even more powerful than that? Meaning that could it be even the sun actually is doing it?
The world's oceans offer another example. They contain large amounts of carbon dioxide. When the oceans heat up, that CO2 is released into the atmosphere.
If you started to warm the surface ocean temperature, the ability for the ocean water to hold this carbon dioxide in the system is a lot less, meaning there will be more of this carbon dioxide effusing out.
All of these theories are being explored by scientists to fully understand the complex factors that influence climate. However, the current political landscape endorses just one theory, that human-generated CO2 is the principal cause of global warming.
Those views are indeed promoted by political bodies, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and there appears to be a corrupted process, in my opinion, of the bodies, where I think science and scientists are being misused in a lot of ways. And these are all becoming really a war of words instead of war of evidence and science that troubles me.
There's a science document, which is really written by scientists for scientists. There's also a summary for policymakers. It's put together by policymakers, and in many cases they go back to the scientists and say, can you change the science document to match our summary? We want to beef this up. We want to make it look worse. That's not the way science is done.
They are clearly promoting the vision that if we do not cut our carbon dioxide emission, disaster, crisis, whichever bad connotation you can find will come to Earth. So it is that kind of alarmism that appalls me as a scientist.
What we have to remember is climate changes and climate fluctuates. And really, while we think humans have an impact on our environment, which we do, the global climate system is still far too complex to be simply affected by one change in one small component of it.
There is no one in the world who would insist that everything is having to do with the sun. All we are trying to do is that there's this plausible picture of how the sun could cause some of the changes in the climate system. Why not study it carefully? It's very, very difficult, in my opinion, to try to insist and suggest that carbon dioxide, even as of today, when we emit this carbon dioxide, is going to drive the climate system. It's a complete false picture, and there's no such scientific basis to support that.
So the idea of science is you're really supposed to be skeptical. So there's always a quest to verify what we know, to understand that we haven't made a mistake, and that we continue on and develop science. And if we've closed our mind, if we close the doors, we are now shutting ourselves out from the real truth, which is what science is all about after all.
There is still much to learn about the many ways in which solar activity, the oceans, and other environmental variations may influence the Earth's climate. But the more scientists are allowed to do their research in an open dialogue, the more they will understand what is truly affecting the Earth's warming today.